All right, some of you remember Steve when he came and did the Convention of States.
About December of last year.
Yeah, close to a year ago. And so he's on his way to Cleveland with Dr. Farris, and they're honoring us by being here. So Steve's going to do the introductions of Dr. Farris.
Thank you, Kay.
You're welcome.
Thanks, great to be here again. And of course, I missed the first entrance down the hill and had to go the back way for the second time, of course. And as Kay said, my name is Steve Steck-Schulte. I am the state director. Steck-Schulte, yes.
I know it, and I've been practicing it, and I knew that I wouldn't get it out.
You did very well. No, you did very well. And I'm the state director for the Convention of States Project of the Citizens for Self-Governance here in Ohio. And I'm here to introduce today's speaker. And Michael Farris, Dr. Michael Farris, has been involved in the conservative movement nationwide for over 30 years, from arguing successfully in the Supreme Court for an Article 5 case in the late 70s, to founding and being the chancellor of Patrick Henry College in Virginia right now, and the founder and president, correct, of the chairman currently, of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and has done incredible work over many, many years for homeschooling across this country. And as also our director of the Convention of States, a project of the Citizens for Self-Governance. And we're here today to just have a brief talk and then some questions and answer. And I want to thank you for ordering up this wonderful weather for us. Yes. It made it easy to come up from Cincinnati. We were in Cincinnati last night and in Columbus Thursday night. And so without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Michael Farris.
Good morning, and thank you all for sitting over in this part of the room so it's easier to get it recorded. And I'll try not to ignore you. Once in a while, I'll try to. And we have, Steve has supplied me with cards because I was the other day describing how the Supreme Court makes decisions. And I said, it's just like card tricks. And so he brought me cards and is going to make me do card tricks later in the talk. To explain how the Supreme Court really works. You think it's law, but it's actually just card tricks. Let me give you just a little background on why I'm kind of wired the way I am, and why I'm approaching the problem with the capacity that I am. When I was, my parents became Christians when I was 3 years old. They raised a non-church family and got saved when I was 3. And they were a part of a conservative evangelical church. In fact, they're still, 60 years later, members of the same exact church in Kennewick, Washington. During my childhood, there were about 6 or 7 families that were their close friends. And about every third or fourth Sunday, those families would get together and have lunch together after Sunday services. And the women would be off in the kitchen cooking the food and getting it all ready. And the men would sit outside on the patio and they'd be solving the problems of the world. They'd solve the problems of the church and talk about what's wrong with the pastor, and all of that. And then they'd go to the city government, they'd go to the school systems, and they'd talk about the state government, and then they'd talk about the national government, and they'd just talk, and it drove me crazy. Because they would never do anything about it. And I basically grew up with an absolute conviction that I would never talk about problems without proposing actual solutions that would actually work. And so, as a result of that, I have been involved in a lot of things in my life. And one of my friends, who just finished being the Secretary of Natural Resources for the state of Virginia, said, don't ever tell Mike Farris your problems. He'll start some organization. So I started the Homeschool Legal Defense Association to defend the rights of homeschoolers, because there was a real problem out there, and they needed legal defense, and people were in serious trouble. And so I saw the need and said, when there's a need and there's a problem, I got to do something about it. And same thing the church, the town we were living in didn't have an evangelical church at the time, and subsequently there have been a couple, but at the time there wasn't one. And I started Blue Ridge Bible Church. I was the first pastor of that church. I started, actually I started a news recycling business, newspaper recycling business before it was popular. It wasn't successful at all, but it had a really cool name. It's still the best name I've ever heard from newspaper recycling. It was called Used News. And so I started that. That didn't work. But, and I started Patrick Henry College because I saw a need in the national capital for a conservative, faithful Christian college that taught a classical approach, taught an original intent of the Constitution to all the students, no matter what their major was, and would influence the nation and the government, the public square in a large way. Bill Bennett's radio producer is one of our graduates, and several Fox News programs have our graduates that work for them, and many, many other things. We send a lot of people to law school, and my goal is to flood the farm league with good people who believe in the original meaning of the Constitution, and eventually some of them are going to land in the majors. And I want to have a majority of Patrick Henry grads on the Supreme Court one of these days. We do okay in that regard. I coach our moot court team, which is legal debate, and we're all right. We won the national championship 8 out of the last 10 years. We beat, and it's not national champion with a small little Christian college, it's everybody. University of Virginia, Duke, Air Force Academy, University of Texas, all of them play. Now, some of the Ivies don't play, but all of the schools that do play, we play, we're against them all, and we're good, actually. The second best school, by the way, in the country is not some Ivy League school, it's Worcester in Ohio. Just to give you some degree of perspective, there's power rankings for these, and the third ranking school in the country has a power ranking of 17. Worcester has a power ranking of 29, and Patrick Henry has a power ranking of 59. And so we do okay in that. And 8 of my graduates right now are at Harvard Law School, and one's at Yale, and we get them trained in the original meaning of the Constitution so that Harvard or Yale won't rule them. And we get them credentials so that we'll take over the country eventually with people who actually believe in the original meaning of the Constitution, which is how I got hijacked. A professor, when I was a junior in college, taught me originalism in a common law class. And I went from being a flaming moderate to being a principled conservative by the influence of Dr. Dick S. Payne. And so I've seen it work before, and it can work again. So I don't believe in not doing things about it. I believe in defending freedom, and I've defended freedom. I believe in changing politics, and I've helped change politics. I've raised millions of dollars for candidates through a PAC that I started. I sent hundreds of thousands of kids out to help get good candidates elected. I've done all these things because I believe all these things are important. But I'm here to tell you, none of that is going to work or matter if we don't do what's really essential, and that is preserve the structure of liberty in this country. There are 3 parts of good government. You have to have good people, which means in the electoral sense, you got to have people that have the right convictions, the right political philosophy, they have the right personal values, they're people of integrity, and they've got good experience. We want good people in office, and we need to work on that. We need to have good policy. Common Core is not good policy. Local control of education is good policy. You've got to have good policy in tax areas. You've got to have good policy. Policy decisions are the day-to-day decisions of government, and we need to have good policy. But what we've neglected in the conservative movement for the almost 40 years I've been involved in it, full-time in this world since 1980. And I was a citizen activist before that, so in some ways, at least 40 years I've been involved. But we have not focused on good structure, the process of decision making. In the most basic sense, it's checks and balances at the federal level, and true federalism, robust federalism, so that the founders were really brilliant people. They understood that the proper scope of government was to give one level and only one level of government all the various assignments. You do national defense, you do education, you do healthcare policy, you do roads, and so on. There was one level and only one level. The proper term for it is exclusive jurisdiction. What we're practicing now is concurrent jurisdiction, where multiple layers of government all deal with the same thing. We've got state, federal, local departments of education. Some places have 4 or 5 levels of departments of education. I remember walking from the New York State School Commissioner's office and walking down to the federal courthouse one day in Albany, New York. Actually, yeah, it was in Albany. And I walked past 5 buildings of government, 5 different layers of government, and every single one of them had a Department of Education in New York. You know, why you need 5 layers of government to do education. It's a full employment for bureaucrats, and it doesn't make the kids a bit of education. And so the idea, the founders really understood that good structure is essential to the correct form of liberty. And the most important rule in any organization, including civil government, is who has the power to make the rules. And that's true of the Student Council at Patrick Henry College. That's true of the Women's Committee at my church. That's true of the NFL. That's true of our federal government. Who has the power to make rules? And some people think that the First Amendment is the most important thing in the Constitution. After all, they say, well, it was the First Amendment. And, they picked it first for a reason. All that does is show that the people who make such an argument don't know anything about American history, because they actually picked it third. There were 12 amendments of the Bill of Rights. Maybe we could shut this door to get the vacuum cleaner. It's the sound of the federal government can even run our taxes. Vacuum cleaner. And so oh, that's much better. Thank you. And so, I don't remember where I was. Third. Okay, thank you. The Bill of Rights, there were 12 Bill of Rights sent out by Congress to be ratified, part of the original Bill of Rights. They just didn't ratify the first 2, and they renumbered. The Third Amendment became the First Amendment. The Fourth Amendment became the Second Amendment. And so what we know, the right to bear arms was originally the Fourth Amendment. And so people who argue the firstness of the First Amendment, well, they don't even know that history. And besides that, they focus on the wrong word, the word's amendment. We added it to the Constitution a little later, 2 years later. The First Amendment, the first provision of the Constitution, rather, is Article 1, Section 1, which says, all legislative authority is vested in the Congress of the United States. Now, that means only the elected legislators have the power to make the rules. That's it. Why? They didn't trust any one person because they had a Christian worldview of the nature of man. They believed that man is basically sinful and therefore cannot be trusted. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. They didn't want the president to have the power to make rules. He's just one guy. The process is corruptible and is going to be corrupted sooner or later. The same thing true for the Supreme Court. Just 9 of them. They didn't want 9 judges. They weren't appointed for that purpose. They weren't given the authority to make it. They didn't want bureaucracies making that because they weren't elected by the people. They certainly didn't want the United Nations, which if they would never contemplated such a thing. I mean, the reason we know for sure is they didn't even want England to be making decisions for America. If you don't want England making decisions, why in the world would you want the whole United Nations making decisions for us? So it just stands to reason. Even though they hadn't contemplated the concept, they didn't want any foreigners making the decisions for the United States. They believed, like Americans had believed since the 1620s, when Virginia first passed the first resolution on this point in the General Assembly of Virginia in 1624, Americans make the tax policy for America only. And for 150 years, that had been our policy, which makes it part of the British Constitution. When the founders argued that British taxation was unconstitutional, they were correct, because the British Constitution is accumulated acts and practices over time. And we've been waiting for you, and now you are going to have to be tested on everything.
Not a problem.
All right. So, come on in and join us. The founders understood the importance of having one body of elected people, the legislators, with numerous members, because you spread the power out to enough people, that's who you can trust with legislative authority, if you give them specific subjects that they can legislate on and nothing else. And you divide that power further by having a division of legislative authority between the states and the federals. And you divide that power even further by having a state house and a state senate, and a U.S. House and a U.S. Senate. checks and balances, many divisions of power, because you can't trust the government. That's what they believed, and that's why they built the structure. And what we have now is an absolute collapse of that system. And what the reality is, people say, and I understand and I get it, and I sympathize entirely with this statement, they don't follow the Constitution anyway. It's not true. The correct way to say that, the most precise way to say that, is they follow the wrong Constitution. Because our Constitution has been perverted into two different documents. There's the Constitution as written by the founders, and there's the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court. And in reality, the U.S. government, in fact, follows the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court, for the most part. There are minor variations on that theme, but pretty much, and eventually it will all get corrected if they don't obey the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court. That's short-lived, and it'll come back into conformance with interpretation by the Supreme Court, which makes the Supreme Court the supreme law of the land, rather than the Constitution being the supreme law of the land. And so, part of the problem, fundamentally, with our country is we've got to correct the Supreme Court in multiple ways. We've got to correct their substance, and we've got to correct their process. I've done that before. Not many times, but I've done it once and done it successfully. You all know about the Hobby Lobby decision. The Hobby Lobby decision was not based upon the free exercise of religion. I've been a free exercise litigator for, well, full-time since 1980. And so I've written books on this. The case I argued in the Supreme Court, that actually argued and got a final decision, I won a 9-0 decision on a religious freedom case out of Washington State. I lost it all the way there and then won it unanimously. Thurgood Marshall wrote the opinion, shock of all shocks. He slept through the whole oral argument, but, except for when I kind of chastised Justice Blackmun. Justice Blackmun said, Counselor, when have we ever funded religious education before? And I said, Justice Blackmun, this court doesn't fund anything. That's up to Congress and the state legislatures to fund things. And the whole courtroom erupted in laughter, and the only thing my co-counsel said, Justice Stevens was laughing so hard, all you could see his bow tie was going, yang, 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 yang. And so, you know, the Supreme Court thinks they run the place. They think they pass laws, and they act that way on a routine basis. But in 1990, in a case called Employment Division versus Smith, the Supreme Court threw the free exercise of religion into the constitutional trash can by ruling that no one can get a religious exemption from a neutral law of general applicability. And I have to unwrap that, because it sounds all fancy-dancy, but it's really pretty easy to explain. Patrick Henry College, that I lead, is a Christian school. There is no way on this earth we're going to hire a homosexual professor. Now, if one snuck through, we didn't know about it, and we found out about it later, we'd fire him. And if we did that, now Virginia doesn't at this point in time have a non-discrimination provision against homosexuals. But that's coming, either at the federal level or at the state level. There's not one yet applicable, but let's say I lived in another state, and I've got that case. A Christian school fires the homosexual professor, and they sue under the non-discrimination law. Now, the law is neutral in general, meaning it wasn't written just to apply to religious organizations. It was written to apply to everybody. McDonald's, Xerox, everybody has to obey the non-discrimination rule. It's neutral and general. And if it's neutral and general, nobody gets an exemption for religious freedom purposes. That's what the Supreme Court held, which is anathema to religious freedom. And so a group of people met in the U.S. Capitol when the Democrats were in charge of both houses of Congress, and Bill Clinton was the president when all this happened. That was mainly Jewish organizations and me. Oh, there are a few others, but on the executive committee, I was the lone conservative in the leadership of this group. I personally named the law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and I was the chairman of the group of lawyers who wrote it. When Hobby Lobby won their decision, it wasn't on the Constitution, because they had trashed the Constitution. But we reversed the Supreme Court and wrote into a statute the original meaning of the Constitution on religious freedom, and we handcuffed the Supreme Court successfully And they voted for Hobby Lobby, even though it was a neutral law of general applicability. Everybody has to furnish abortion coverage to their employees. And so Hobby Lobby said, violates our religious beliefs. And because of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that I was one of the key leaders in getting, we reversed the Supreme Court. And even Justice Scalia, who wrote the first bad decision, he's good on a lot of stuff, but not on religious freedom. He's not good on parents' rights either. Even Scalia voted for Hobby Lobby because we reversed the law. We changed what the law that the Supreme Court had to obey. And so it can be done if you know what you're doing and you do it correctly. It's very rare that you can do that through a statute. Virtually all the time, most of the time anyway. In all structural issues, you have to do that through a constitutional amendment. It's the only way it can be done to reverse the Supreme Court. Because supposedly they're interpreting the Constitution. So, it's not really the Constitution. So you either throw the justices off the Supreme Court somehow, or you reverse it through a constitutional amendment. And the only realistic way to do it in a lifetime, within a 20-year period, is to write a new constitutional provision to reverse the Supreme Court decision. Which brings us, I'm going to take you back now to 1787 and George Mason. The founders knew that they weren't writing a perfect document. They thought it was really good. It turned out to be even better than they thought. But it wasn't perfect. They hadn't dealt with slavery. They needed to deal with slavery. We had to have the 13th Amendment to deal with slavery. And it wasn't perfect in other ways. We didn't have the Bill of Rights, for heaven's sakes. So it wasn't perfect. We had to have amendments. And so, so they knew they were going to have amendments. And so they were writing a provision on how do you get amendments. And the answer that they'd come up with to the, almost the end of the convention was this. Congress proposes all amendments, and the states ratify all amendments. Sounds nice and balanced until George Mason stood up and said, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, hey guys, what's going to happen when we need to amend the power of Congress? And Congress must be the sole organ to propose amendments. They'll never propose anything that will limit their own power. And of course he was right. And Mason was doing more than that. He was not saying that what if. He said they will abuse their power. And we've got to give the states the unilateral ability to amend the Constitution. Because otherwise you'll never have real checks and balances on Congress. And so they added a second methodology. Either can be used. Congress can propose amendments, then the states ratify, or the states can propose amendments, and then the states ratify. How do the states propose amendments? The states propose amendments by 2/3 of the states calling for an Article 5 convention, most properly called the Convention of the States. When Virginia passed the first application for a Convention of the States in November of 1788, they, in that document, called it a Convention of the States. They called for a Convention of the States. That's the correct historical terminology. Some people who are out sowing half-truths about this say we just made it up. Well, no, we didn't. Virginia made it up in 1788, and it's the correct historical term. And it's been called that many, many times since then, including 1789, 1791, and so on. So it wasn't just an aberration that Virginia did it. That is the correct historical term. And so, but you remember in the Articles of Confederation period that they kept having problems with trying to fix anything because you needed unanimous consent. One state could effectively nullify all state laws. In Rhode Island, being a Baptist state, and I'm an ordained Baptist pastor, so I'm qualified to criticize Baptists, and fully qualified to criticize Baptists. And so Rhode Island, being a Baptist state, was being cantankerous, just like my fellow Baptists are wanting to do, wouldn't agree to anything. And they were effectively nullifying. They did not want to give one state alone the power to thwart progress and changes and needed implementations. They wanted the states, plural, to be able to stop the federal government. And so they created Article 5. And we have 400 applications for an Article 5 convention in the history of the Republic. Ohio has done many of them over the course of time. And including an application that's still on the books calling for a convention to stop polygamy. And it was done when Utah was becoming a state. And we never got 2/3 of the country, 2/3 of the states, to call for a convention for polygamy purposes, so you never had a convention on polygamy. But what we've done over 200 years with 400 applications is we've created an absolutely lock-solid precedent that says this: you have to have an agreement among the states on the subject matter or you don't have a convention. When the states agree on the subject matter of X, 34 states, then you have a convention on X. The X that we want to have a convention on has this application. We call a convention solely for the purpose of proposing amendments to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and impose term limits on federal officials, which could include either Congress or the courts or both. Frankly, of those two, I'm more inclined to do term limits on the courts because there's a form of ability to get rid of Congress by elections. There's no way to get rid of the courts, period. And so the greater need is for term limits on the judiciary. That's the rule of germaneness, or if you're a high school debater, topicality. What topics you can legitimately talk about at the convention. Now, there have been 32 multi-state conventions held in the history of the Republic. None of them, 2/3 of them before the Constitutional Convention, 1/3 after the Constitutional Convention. Well, one of them was the Constitutional Convention, but so the math has to be adjusted slightly. But 32 total, and there have been 2 rules at every single convention. Number 1, one state, one vote. Number 2, every one of them has adhered to the subject matter for which it was called. Now, some people who think they know American history, and I was one of them 20 years ago, say, well, the original Constitutional Convention was the result of a runaway convention, and they illegally changed the rules, and the Constitution was adopted as a result of a runaway convention. Now, of course, how that would apply to the context we're talking about is, they say, well, if that one ran away, then this one can run away too. Well, people shouldn't get their history from the Common Core, or the public schools, ever, really. You should get your history from the original documents. And people who make that argument really are anti-constitutionalists. They claim, many of them claim to be constitutionalists, but they really are anti-constitutionalists because you cannot be a constitutionalist and think it was illegally adopted. It's utterly inconsistent. It's like saying George Washington was a great American hero, but he was also a British spy. You know, pick your position, buddy. You know, either you think the Constitution was lawfully adopted, or you don't. And we shouldn't do it blindly, we should know the actual history. So I'm going to teach you the actual history so you can have utter confidence that the Constitution was properly adopted. So here we go. We'll start with the Annapolis Convention. Virginia called the Annapolis Convention one of the states to get together to talk about commerce, which means shipping and trade. That's what it meant. It didn't mean manufacturing or mining or agriculture or even banking. It's shipping and trade. And 5 states showed up. It was held in Annapolis, Maryland. Maryland was not one of the 5 states that showed up. I don't know, I guess it wasn't convenient. And so the Annapolis Convention quickly concluded 2 things. A, there weren't enough states there. And B, they didn't have the authority to talk about what they needed to talk about, and that is the structure of government generally. And so they passed a resolution, which is, there's a formal legal term for this, and I'll try to explain it, but you know, I have years of education, and I don't know if I can, it's called a YADA resolution, which means you ought to do this, you ought to do that, you ought to do the other thing. And I hope that that wasn't too complex. And so it was a YADA resolution. It had no legal authority whatsoever. It was just a recommendation back to the states to say, you ought to call a convention that had a different purpose. And the convention that was the purpose they recommended is they wanted a convention to discuss how to, and I quote, render the federal constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union, end of quote. They said that they were going to send a notice to Congress out of respect, but because Congress had no jurisdiction over the matter, they weren't asking Congress for anything, which is a good attitude, by the way. They were asking the states to agree to come and use their residual sovereignty as states to come and agree to effectively rewrite the treaty. They were under a treaty called the Articles of Confederation, and sovereign states can rewrite a treaty at any time if they all agree to. That's the deal. If they all agree to, they can rewrite the treaty at any time. So they said, we're going to go back to our states and ask our state legislatures not to pass any yada stuff, but to pass a formal resolution naming official delegates or commissioners, they're like ambassadors in effect, to send us to a convention. And Virginia and New Jersey on the same day were the first two to call for the Constitutional Convention. And what they said the delegates were supposed to do is the same thing as at the Annapolis Convention. They said, we want them to render the federal Constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union. Not one word about only amend the articles. It was render the federal Constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union. They named its time, May 1787. They named the place, Philadelphia. They named the subject matter, render the federal Constitution adequate. They named their delegates by name, and they sent them off with authority. 7 states did that before Congress passed another yada resolution. And their yada resolution was simply an endorsement of the Constitutional Convention, like National Pickle Week. You know, it had no more authority. It was a yada resolution. And it starts off reading, Congress is of the opinion that it would be expedient to have a convention, and they named the same time and place that the states had already called for. Nobody thought that Congress was picking the time. Now, down in paragraph 4, or 3 or something, toward the end of this yada resolution, Congress said, only to amend the Articles of Confederation. Well, thank you for your advice, Congress. It's like National Pickle Week. You know, everybody who knows anything about that period of American history knows this. Congress has 0 implied powers. None. And there's nothing in the Articles of Confederation about any such conventions. They didn't have authority to call one or name the delegates or instruct the delegates from the states. It would be like the UN purporting to instruct the delegates from the United States if you're going to attend an environmental convention, and the UN General Assembly thinks that they can tell the U.S. delegates what they have to do. Well, you know, you and whose army are going to tell us what to do? They can't do that now, even under the crazy international system we have. That would be the same thing, and nobody thought they were doing that. By the way, if you don't trust me to have given you the accurate history, go back and read Federalist 40. James Madison lays it all out, and it says exactly what I'm telling you today. And so their authority came from the states. Now, 7 states voted to call the convention, name their delegates and all that, before Congress endorsed it. 5 more states did the same thing afterwards. Of those, 2 states did it a little differently. New York and Massachusetts. Where's the surprise there? Mm-hmm. And New York and Massachusetts said for their delegates, they gave them potentially conflicting instructions. They told them, on the one hand, render the federal Constitution adequate for the exigency of the Union, and then they told them, only amend the Articles. The New York delegates, when they got there and saw that they were going to actually render the federal Constitution adequate, they went home, except for Alexander Hamilton. He didn't vote because their instructions were, you can't vote unless there's at least 2. And so he just participated, but he didn't vote. And Massachusetts stayed and voted. Madison defends in Article Federalist 40 that Massachusetts delegates did the right thing. But we're talking about a historical footnote about Massachusetts and New York delegates, whether or not they obeyed or didn't obey their instructions. It has nothing to do with the fundamental legality of the convention. Rhode Island didn't show up at all. And so unanimous participation wasn't required to draft the thing. What was required was unanimous consent once it's drafted. That's what's required by international law principles, by treaty principles, by the principles of sovereign entities getting together and deciding how to reorganize themselves. And that's what they were doing. And so they obeyed their instructions. They didn't disobey. It was not a runaway convention. Well, people make the advanced argument. Well, yeah, but they changed the rules for ratification. The Articles of Confederation said, you had to have vote of Congress and unanimous consent of the states. Well, people make that argument, and I've made that argument. I've learned about this over time myself, but that's not the correct way to analyze it. because they weren't going under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, there's no provision for conventions. They were using a residual sovereignty. But, you remember the state appointments, where they named their delegates and gave them, in those, all but a couple of them said explicitly, and the others, it's implied, to the same effect. You got to send this to Congress to get its approval, and you've got to have all 13 states agree on the work product. That's what they said. Now, it's the same rule as in the Articles of Confederation, but it's not from the same source. The source is A, the appointment from the states, and B, the recognized principles of international law, how sovereign entities deal with each other. It's always by unanimous consent. Has always been from the beginnings of any dealings of sovereign entities, and it's still the rule today in international law. And so it's by unanimous consent. So they wrote that in, and that was the understanding. Well, so how did that happen then? Because they went from requiring unanimous consent to 13 states, or excuse me, from 13 states to 9 states. And they went from state legislatures having to consent to state ratifications having to consent, which is actually the bigger change. The unanimous is, important change, but it's a bigger change to go from legislatures to conventions. How did that happen? Was that illegal? Well, not if you know the whole story. Like old Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. The rest of the story is this. The Constitutional Convention did exactly what they were told by their instructions. They sent it off to Congress and asked Congress, that was step one. And Congress unanimously approved 2 things. They approved the convention, the Constitution itself, and they approved the new methodology. So the Constitution said, under the new methodology, send it to the state ratification conventions. They didn't send it to the state ratifications conventions. They sent it to the state legislatures under the old methodology. Because before you could call the conventions, all 13 state legislatures would have to consent to the new methodology. And that's what they did. They sent it to the state legislatures. All 13 state legislatures agreed to the new methodology by calling constitutional conventions. That's the way you agree. You call one, or ratification conventions rather. And all 13 states called ratification conventions. 11 of those ratification conventions approved the Constitution, 2 rejected it. Rhode Island rejected it outright in a Baptist congregational meeting. Every voter in Rhode Island was a delegate, and they voted 10-1 against the Constitution. But the legislature approved the new methodology, which is the critical thing, for the process to be correct. North Carolina tabled the Constitution. But again, the legislature approved the methodology by calling the convention. And so all 13 states, they did not change illegally the ratification method. They changed the ratification method lawfully. And if you agree to if you have unanimous consent for a new ratification method, it's obvious that the new ratification method is valid because everybody agreed to it. So the people that think and teach that the Constitution was illegally ratified are enemies of the Constitution. They mean well. They mean well. People can be well motivated. It's like a player on a football team who intercepts a pass and accidentally runs the wrong way down the field. He means well. And these people mean well. But they're running the wrong way down the field. And they're trying to score a touchdown for the other team by arguing that the Constitution was illegally adopted. They quote people like Warren Burger. Warren Burger was a co-author of Roe v. Wade, who doesn't believe in the original meaning of the Constitution. He wants to have a loosey-goosey Constitution. And he and his ilk, like him, don't want people paying too much attention. And so it's in his self-interest, it's consistent with his political philosophy to say, don't pay too much attention to the words of the Constitution. After all, it was illegally adopted in the first place. I don't think we listen to people like that. I would rather listen to James Madison than the co-author of Roe v. Wade, thank you very much. And so that's the truth. And so the people who argue runaway convention nonsense do it out of not just historical error, it's historical defamation against the founders and the Constitution itself. And I defy them to continue such error in the face of the absolute truth. Now, so how does the process work? 34 states agree to Proposition X. Our X, again, is fiscal restraints, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and term limits. Okay. 3 states have done that. Georgia, Florida, Alaska. This year, in January through June, voted to completely, so we got 3 out of the 34 states done. Arizona and Alabama, we had pretty close to a sweep of the A states, agreed to do that, but only in their House. We got to go back next year and finish it up and get their Senate to come along. And so and Missouri passed it in committee. So we made good, for the first year, that's good progress. Our goal is to do this in 3 to 4 years. This year we're aiming at about 20 states, Ohio being one of them. And so we are doing the organization, the political spade work necessary, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But we're doing what's necessary to get to 34 states no later than 2017, hopefully by 2016. And so at the convention, again, 1 state, 1 vote, 26 states, a simple majority, has to agree on the exact text. Now, what kind of things will be written? You have to do it at the convention. There's no way, politically or legally or otherwise, other than writing the text at the convention. Let's take the balanced budget amendment, which would be one of the things that would be germane. Not only, I want taxing limitations, I want spending limitations, I want to limit their ability to regulate business by fixing the Commerce Clause, I want to fix the General Welfare Clause, I want to stop the regulatory agencies from being able to pass laws, I want all laws passed by Congress, no more executive orders, I want to stop the use of treaties to control the domestic law of the United States. Bob Dole's going around the country criticizing me for stopping treaties. I'm proud of that. He wants to criticize me. I'm proud of the fact that I've killed the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the CEDAW, the Women's Convention. I'm pretty much the point guy in killing all those treaties. And so the, I don't want treaties used for the domestic policy of the United States because I have the audacity to believe that Americans should make the law for America. And so, there are effective ways to do this, and you can go be like my dad's group of friends and talk about it on the patio. I don't believe in talking about it on the patio. I believe in going and getting it done. I've gotten it done and stopping those. But I want to stop them permanently. I don't want to just, it's like engaging in a knife fight with the big Egyptian in Indiana Jones. Eventually you're going to get sliced a little bit if you get in a knife fight. I don't want any treaties to pass. I don't want to just kill most of them. I want to pull the plug by the equivalent of pulling your gun and shooting the big Egyptian in the gut. I want to ban the use of treaties for domestic purposes in this country. And you do that by changing the wording of the Constitution. The founders never would have imagined that treaties would have been used for such purposes. But they said that treaties are the supreme law of the land, right along the Constitution. And so we've got to fix that. So those are some of the things that would be done at the convention. But the particular wording, and we'll use the balanced budget amendment as an example. How do you word the balanced budget amendment so that it doesn't end up being, you have to have a balanced budget unless it's windy outside, or if it's an odd-numbered year or something. Because if Congress is going to write a balanced budget amendment, you're going to realize it's going to be a fake balanced budget amendment. It's not going to have any teeth into it. And so there are tricks to it. One of the tricks is, how would you write the override procedure? Because everybody recognizes if there was a true emergency, I'll make up an emergency. A meteor hits Oklahoma and it kills people in 7 surrounding states and 25 million people die. Okay, that would be a national emergency. And it might take you a little while. You might need to spend more than you get that year to deal with something of that magnitude. Okay? Let's take that. Well, I would allow an override on a balanced budget under 2 conditions. If there's a declared war, no more phony undeclared wars. If there's a declared war, then yes, of course. But a national emergency, how do you do a national emergency so it doesn't end up being misused? You don't do it by trying to write content. You do it by methodology. I would require 75% of both houses of Congress to agree to a national emergency. And to prevent them from abusing that, I would say the 3rd year in a row that you declare a national emergency, every member of Congress is ineligible for re-election or any form of federal service. They can't ever be reelected, you can't run for president, you can't be appointed as a judge, you can't be appointed as a bureaucrat or anything. You're done. Because otherwise you have a temptation just to buy votes. That's why they spend more than they're doing today. They're just buy-in votes. And so you can remove that temptation if you put a lifetime ban on any further federal service to prevent them from abusing that. That's the kind of detail that you need to put in your writing. And when you have 26 states agreeing on the details, that's what the final proposal will be, and it'll be sent out to the states. I would envision there being someplace between 7 and 10 amendments. Like the Bill of Rights, you vote them up or down individually. So if there's 7 that are sent out, the states could vote to approve any number of the 7, 1 or 7 or anything in between. And it takes 38 states to agree. So now that you know the process, let's reconsider the argument that this would be a runaway convention, or could be a runaway convention. That, the liberals will come and they'll take over. Well, yeah, Congress takes over. Okay, all this nonsense. People who argue that don't know how to judge political reality. I'm going to give you an example of how to judge political reality. What are the chances of me being appointed by President Obama to the next Supreme Court vacancy?
Oh, no.
I am fully qualified to be on the Supreme Court. I have all the credentials necessary, I have all the background necessary. I can answer any question that anybody has. I am fully qualified to be on the Supreme Court. What are the chances? 0. Because Obama would never do it, and the Senate would never confirm me, even if there was Bobby Jindal comes in. I'm friends with Bobby Jindal. He might appoint me to the Supreme Court. What are the chances of the U.S. Senate confirming me? 0. I'm too conservative. And so political reality enters into our calculus on things on a regular basis. And so if you have that sense of political reality, we can start figuring out what are the chances of something bad happening. I am on one of the boards of the NRA, not the main governing board, but their education board. So you can figure out what I believe about the Second Amendment and gun control. I'm in favor of gun control if you define it correctly. Correct gun control is a steady aim, squeeze your trigger, hit your target. That's good gun control. And so and by the way, the outside counsel for the NRA, Chuck Cooper, has endorsed our project. And if he thought that there was any chance of the Second Amendment being an issue, you wouldn't get the top lawyer for the NRA to endorse our project specifically. He's on our legal advisory board, Chuck Cooper. And so the process goes like this. You had to have 34 states agree to the agenda. Well, people say, well, you can change the agenda. The case that I helped argue on Article 5, which did go to the Supreme Court, but we didn't do oral argument, because it was about the Equal Rights Amendment. And as you may recall, the Equal Rights Amendment was given originally a 7-year ratification period. And then they tried to change that to add approximately 3.5 years onto the end of it, and so they could get 38 states to ratify. Well, they never got 38 states to ratify, so eventually the Supreme Court ruled that it was moot. But in the meantime, we argued the case in the Federal District Court, and the Federal District Court ruled in the case I helped litigate, and I did part of the oral argument. They said, you can't change the rules in the middle of the string. And there are a lot of Article 5 cases out there that we're not writing on a blank slate like people think. There are a lot of Article 5 cases out there. And one of those that I litigated, you can't change the rules in the middle of the string. And so we have a 200-year absolutely solid precedent. You can't call a convention without agreement on the subject matter. You add to that, you can't change the rules in the middle of the string. Then you realize it's got to stick to the subject matter. Beyond that, we've got the votes, folks. I was a beach lifeguard for 4 years. And then I wimped out and was a pool lifeguard for the last 5 years of lifeguarding. Because I moved to a place, there wasn't beaches. And I was in law school at that point. And so when I was a beach lifeguard, the first 2 years, it was along the Columbia River in eastern Washington. And it was 100 degrees for 45 days in a row. 110 for 10 of those days or something like that. Eastern Washington is a desert. A lot of people don't know that. But that's where I grew up. And so 1 week a year they had unlimited hydroplane races in the park that I lifeguarded at, and on the Columbia River. And that week was wild. And there was a carnival, and there were carnies, and they were a rough crowd, and there was rough people, and it was wild on our beach that week. there were fights, and we became part lifeguards and part policemen that week. I didn't want to fight the carnies on the land. They were tougher than me on the land. They were more experienced, but they did not want to fight me in the water. And I took a couple people for a little tour of the bottom of the lagoon. And so I don't want to fight the liberals in Washington, D.C., thank you very much. Washington, D.C. will never, ever, ever, I don't care who you send to Washington, D.C., will ever do structural changes, ever. The conservatives that go there are more affected by Washington, D.C. than they affect Washington, D.C. You know, there's some principled guys that the Tea Party helped elect, 4 years ago or so, and there's a handful of them that are really doing the right thing. But as a movement, Washington, D.C. affected the Tea Party candidates more than the Tea Party candidates affected Washington, D.C. And so it's just built into the system. That's the beach, folks. Big cities, big money, big government, big media control Washington, D.C. We don't have strength to fight them in Washington, D.C. We've got strength in the states. 27 states are controlled, both houses, by Republicans. 6 states, 1 House Republican, 1 House Democrat. 17 states are controlled, both houses, by Democrats. Do the math. Okay? How do you get to, you have to get to 34 first. Can the 17 get to 34? Is there any pattern for the 17 Democrat states to get to 34? Well, they have to win all 6 of the split states. That gets them 23. Plus, then they have to get 11 Republican states to get to 34. What are the chances of that? 0. Okay, let's do it the other way around. We got 27 Republican states. The 6 split states, one of which is New York, and I discard that. I don't even know why New York's a split state. We got 5 split states. 27 plus 5, that's 32. I need 2 Democrat states. West Virginia is a Democrat state changing to a Republican state. Nevada is a Democrat state, conservative Democrat state. And so I have to convert Nevada and West Virginia, a much more plausible scenario. We can convert to our issues. They can convert to, they cannot convert. They don't have the votes to get to 34. And by the way, if they don't have the votes to get to 34, they don't have the votes to get to 38 because it's a different voting system. When you're voting on ratification, one house voting no is no. On passing something, you got to have both houses. So if you're trying to kill something bad, all you need is 1 house in 13 states. And you've got 33 states with 1 house at least being Republican. Now, people will say, well, Republicans aren't always that conservative. Don't have to be conservative on everything. They have to be conservative on one issue. Who should have more power, the states or Congress? Because that's what we're talking about. And it's in their self-interest for the answer to be the states. We're asking state legislators who should have more power. You guys are Washington, D.C. And they're going, well, maybe me. No, why is that in the people's interest? Because the people have a lot more impact on state legislatures than they do on Congress. It's easier to change them, it's easier to talk to them, it's easier to influence them, it's easier to throw the rascals out. And so that's why it's in the people's interest, because we want government closer to us so we can keep better watch over it. And so it's more unified. You know, the beliefs of the various parts of Ohio are not as diverse as comparing Ohio to Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York City. And so, you know, just the diversity of opinion is more contained within a state. And you have a better chance of getting to, you know, solutions that Ohio will agree to. So on this issue, the Republicans are conservative on how much power should the states have versus Congress. And so the chances of something bad happening are exactly the same as the chance of me being appointed to the Supreme Court by President Obama or being confirmed by the U.S. Senate. You know, theoretically possible, yes, but if you can count and do math and have any idea of how politics works, the answer is 0. And so beyond that, we've got litigation strategies. I've litigated and won before on when Congress was controlled by both houses, were controlled by Democrats when we litigated that case, and we won and we beat Congress. And so, you know, don't tell me that you can't beat Congress. Don't tell me you can't beat the courts. Been there, done that, got the T-shirt. So the people that argue that we should fear all this stuff aren't correctly assessing the real risks. Let's just assess the risks. We leave the situation as it is. In 2020, the Center for Public Integrity says that 89% of all federal revenues will have to be devoted to 4 things. Interest on the national debt, not principal, interest on the national debt, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. That's it, 89%. Don't think that's some right-wing organization giving us phony figures. The Center for Public Integrity has a board member named Ariana Huffington. So I am not using conservative numbers. I'm taking the liberal zone numbers on this one. Actually, I've seen conservative numbers that said the actual number is 94% at the same period. But there's not a big difference between those numbers. It's unsustainable either way. Either way, utterly unsustainable. And so if we do nothing, liberty's going to crash. They're spying on our cell phones, they're tapping our email accounts, they're not obeying the Fourth Amendment. We have got to fix this. And we've got to have real checks and balances on the Supreme Court. 30 times the Supreme Court has said there's no limitation on our power except for our own internal sense of self-restraint. I don't want to live in a country where there's no better checks on the Supreme Court than that. I want to add to the Constitution, in addition to high crimes and misdemeanors, you can impeach the Supreme Court justices for failing to follow the original meaning of the Constitution. And I want to change the impeachment authority from Washington, D.C. to the states. And I'd like the states, frankly, to appoint the Supreme Court justices, not Washington, D.C. You want real checks and balances? You have the state appoint the Supreme Court of the United States. That'll do a much better job of keeping federal power in check at the Supreme Court level. You make some structural changes like this, we will be following the Constitution much more closely to the one as written rather than the one as interpreted by the Supreme Court. The convergence will be better, the divergence will be much diminished. That's the plan, ladies and gentlemen, and we can do this. 100 people in a legislative district can make this happen, can get the votes. Our goal is to have 75% of the legislative districts in 40 states organized. By organized, we mean a district captain and 100 people who will, our slogan is stand up, speak up, and show up, which means contact your legislator and tell them you want a convention of states to limit the power of the federal government. 100 people will do it. Now, the best way to explain it is if there's 300, that's 300,000 people nationwide. That's nothing. That's 1/10 of 1%. The email list I control for Homeschool Legal Defense Association has 300,000 families. Now, it took me a while to build that list. Mark Meckler, my partner in this, was the co-founder of Tea Party Patriots. He built a list in a few years of 4 million people. Both of us know how to build lists, build grassroots support. It's not building lists, building grassroots support. They'll end up on a computer list because we got to email them because we don't have the money to send physical mail to everybody. It's too hard to walk to their houses and tell them one by one. And so we email people. And so we do need lists, but because that's the method of getting to the grassroots. And 1/10 of 1% of the population will be successful. Now, some districts may be a little harder, so let's take the biggest case I can imagine, 1,000 people being necessary to contact the state legislator. Usually, I asked the Speaker of the House of Virginia this last year, how many is a lot of calls on an issue? He told me one legislator was complaining he got so many calls on an issue, and he asked me how many, the answer was 6.
Oh.
And so 6 is considered a lot of calls. And so 100, almost unheard of. They've never gotten 1,000. A state legislator who gets 1,000 calls saying, please climb a persimmon tree and sing I Want to Hold Your Hand in Spanish, more than 50% will do it. And so 1,000 calls is utterly unheard of. So you give me 1,000 people in the legislative district, that's 3 million people. That's all I need. Now, why will 3 million people save the country? All forms of politics, the winner is decided by the percentage, the majority of people who participate. Always. In elections, it's a majority of people who participate. This is lobbying. This is not electoral. This is lobbying. In lobbying, you never have more than 1% of the people actively participate. Ever. Ever. If we get 1% of the people who stand up, speak up, and show up, we will be the majority of the people who actually participate. Which explains why, when I have led the homeschooling movement for over 30 years. We beat the teachers union, the superintendent's association, the state school board, the school boards association, the principals association. The entire education establishment was against this teeny tiny little group. And we won state after state after state, which is the same venue we're fighting in this, because we out-organized them. Plus, we were doing what was right morally, and we depended upon God. That's the formula for success. Out-organize them, do what's right, depend on God, and we'll win. I've done it over a 30-year career, and I don't believe that I've been prepared for this moment by accident. I think that this is the time, this is the place, this is the cause, and liberty has to be saved. Now, I'm sure that some of you will be surprised when I give you these numbers. Here are the most important numbers I'm going to give you all day. I have 10 kids and 17 grandkids. Last night at my house, they had the baby shower for my daughter Angie, who's going to give us our 18th grandchild in February. And so the liberals try to take over America by killing babies. We take over America by having babies. And so I have a vested interest in making sure that we hand liberty to our posterity. And I'm not going to be like those guys that I saw in the patio when I was a kid, stand around talking about it. They meant well. They were good men. They meant well. But somebody needed to come along and show them how to actually get something done. Well, I have had the life experience, and God's been gracious to me and allowed me to have the life experience, that I know how to get it done. And this was my plan. I launched the website for this 7 days before Mark Levin published his book on exactly the same subject. Mark and I knew each other by reputation. We didn't know each other. Now, obviously, he didn't write a book in 6 days, and I didn't create his website overnight. We both were working on the project. Exactly the same idea. We live 8 miles apart. Now we're good friends. And we view it as a divine coincidence. He wanted somebody to actually build the project. I wanted somebody to write the book. He wrote the book and pushed it out there and pushed the movement forward. I say push the movement forward 5 years in the space of 2 months. It was that important of an event. And Mark Levin has endorsed our project and is on our legal advisory board. And so we see each other at the grocery store. I still don't know where the bunker is, but I know where he shops for the groceries. And so I can't tell you, I'd have to kill you. But this is going to happen. And you can help us make history. So I just ask you to help us. You can sign up, get involved. The basic help is stand up, speak up, show up. Call your legislators and tell them you want to do this. There's more levels of participation. If you want to participate in a more thorough fashion, you talk to Steve, our state director, and he'll help you get involved. There's things from a few hours a month to a little bit more of activity. Your choice. But the basic things, just sign up so we have your email address so we can tell you when the votes are coming. And it will be voted on in Ohio. I can't tell you exactly when. I can't promise you we're going to win, but it looks very good. We've been meeting with legislators the last 3 days, and it looks very good. So with that, I'm happy to answer any and all questions, friendly, not friendly, curious, whatever. Any questions anybody has?
What's your take on the idea that the Supreme Court wouldn't rule on the marriage issue discussed?
I've been deeply involved in that issue. I don't know whether to give you the full answer or the Reader's Digest version. Which answer do you want, the full answer?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, in 1995, I was at a meeting in the Dallas airport at one of the hotels that are inside the Dallas airport. All the top conservative, social conservative leaders in the country, the Christian movement, the social conservative, everybody was there. And there were about 40 of us. And everybody got a chance to share what they thought was the most important issue that we should, or at least an important issue that we should talk about. And I stood up and said, it was my turn, and said, here's what's going to happen. Some state Supreme Court is going to rule that same-sex marriage is a constitutional right. That's going to spread to a few more states, and then eventually a federal district court is going to rule that it's a federal constitutional right under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Then eventually the Supreme Court of the United States is going to hold that same-sex marriage is a constitutional right, and then we're stuck. The only solution to this scenario is not state amendments, it's a U.S. constitutional amendment, because the only way you can stop the 14th Amendment interpretation is by a U.S. constitutional amendment. One of the leaders said, well, Mike, you got a solution in search of a problem. And when the problem is acute, then we'll deal with it. Phase 2, about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a group called the Arlington Group. Basically the same folks that were in Dallas. And we met in a series of meetings. And the issue was, how now? Now the issue is acute. How do we draft a marriage amendment? And the draft that was on the table, and that had been floated by the top leadership of that group, said we're going to ban same-sex marriage and allow civil unions. Civil unions give 100% of the rights of spouses, of marriage, to the spouse. They're just changing the name and giving the substance. To which I said, I don't care if you call it cantaloupe soup. If you're giving them 100% of the rights of marriage, it's marriage. And so, and the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court got it right on one thing in their infamous first same-sex marriage case. They said a marriage is an agreement between 3 parties, 2 consenting spouses and an approving state. They're asking for, they can go have their ceremonies if they want to, and go to the First Church of What's Happening Now, and nobody's stopping them from doing that. What they're asking for is the approval of the state on their union. The approval of the state is the approval by me and you and all of us, because we're the state. And they're asking us to bless what I believe, by your question, I assume you believe, is morally evil. And so I can't bless that. And I don't want my state to bless that, because that means I bless that. And so the way we decide things like that is through politics. And so they're not deciding it through the electoral process, they use the courts. And so, I got that group called the Arlington Group to vote 22-3 to do it the right way, to ban same-sex marriage and civil unions, period. And 2 days later, those top echelon leaders went and made a side deal with the Republican leadership in Congress, which is headquartered at the Waffle House, and explains their political philosophy. And they proposed, they put on the table the civil union blessing form of it, and a bunch of us pulled out. Bill Bennett and I and Concerned Women for America and Eagle Forum and a bunch of us walked away and said, God will never bless your efforts. That's when marriage died, right then and there. Now, in Lawrence versus Texas, which I wrote an amicus brief in, I wrote an amicus brief in the one before that where they ruled correctly, in Bowers versus Hardwick, the Supreme Court held that same-sex activity was a constitutional right. Scalia, in his dissent, said, if you guys don't realize that they've just legalized same-sex marriage, you don't know how to read Supreme Court opinions. And he was right. And so what the Supreme Court did this week was leave in place their pre-existing decision that was written in wraps. And so the lower courts have been ruling same-sex marriage to be a constitutional right. They aren't making this stuff up. They're wrong, and they should have the courage to stand against it. But in Lawrence and in the more recent, Prop 8 case from California, the Supreme Court has already made this ruling, and this is just cleanup stuff. This isn't novel. And so this goes to tell you why we need to get rid of the power of the judiciary to rewrite the law. Because all legislative authority is vested in the Congress of the United States. You can't trust these corrupt people in the Supreme Court. And so, there's your long answer.
Megan Kelly the other night on Fox,
Yeah.
she said, it's here. She said, you haven't seen it yet. It's gonna be in every single state, it's
Yeah.
here.
It's here, it is. I mean, the fact that, there is no court that will be able to successfully stand up. No, the most conservative court in the country is the Supreme Court of Alabama. This gets to the Supreme Court of Alabama, they're going to rule it to be regular marriage should be constitutional. The litigants there will go to the Fifth Circuit instead. And you're going to have the Fifth Circuit rule. The Supreme Court may be forced, if you can get if you can get a case to the Alabama Supreme Court, they may be forced to directly do what they've been doing indirectly. But what they're going to do then probably is a one-sentence opinion, vacating it in light of their prior opinion in X. And so, because they don't want to give people another ground to march on the Supreme Court like they do for Roe versus Wade and the March for Life. they don't want the March for Marriage because they're trying to protect their integrity. That's nonsense, they know it, and they are a bunch of people doing card tricks, and I promised you card tricks.
I have a question.
Here's how the Supreme Court makes decisions. Okay, so, we're gonna do a card trick here, and the first one's just a warm-up trick. Pick a card, any card. Jack of clubs. I was looking at it. That's not a very good card trick, is it? It's kind of, okay. All right, now, pick a card, any card, and don't show it to me.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, this is a little harder when we're not looking at it. Okay, now, I want you to show it to everybody, not me.
Okay.
Everybody got it?
Yeah, so show everybody else.
Everybody else see it?
Everybody else, show it to everybody else.
Okay. All right. So, now, I saw it. Oh, you accidentally twisted it.
Oh,
So just try it again. And this time,
okay.
take it, here, you take the whole deck, take a card out of that,
Show it.
show it to
Show everybody.
everybody, and then put it back in the deck.
Okay.
All right.
All right, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I'm gonna lay the cards out in 3 piles here. You come over here and watch me, and I want you to tell me which pile this card's in. Which pile?
It's the one on the far right.
This one?
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Far right, that figures.
Of course. In my world, there's the far right. No, we're not done. You stay here.
You gotta do it 2 more times.
Yeah. You know phase 1 of the trick back there, and phase 2's you may or may not know.
Polar opposite. Back to the original.
Okay. Is it in this group here?
It is.
Okay.
You know your trick too.
Yeah, I'll teach you the trick. Okay. Now, these 2 piles are A, these 2 piles are B. Pick A or B.
B.
Oh, you know what? You're picking. You guys know which card it is? You do?
Yeah, we do.
Get Will. I forgot. You shouldn't be picking
Well, we
A or
need
B.
your help. We need your help real quick.
That's not any trick for you to pick your card. You know your card.
It's for you to pick the card.
It's for Will to pick the
Oh,
card.
the will to pick the card.
All right. Okay, you're picking A or B. Okay?
Let's go over there and pick.
Okay, come over here. All right. I already cut it down by half. You still can't. You got 1 in 8 choices of picking the card correctly. Pile A or pile B? Which you want?
Pile
Okay. All right. A or B? A or B?
Yeah, that's it.
You got the card? Okay, here's how I do it. The 3 piles thing, you just put the pile that's in the middle, the pile that the card's in the middle 3 times in a row. And by math, it's the 11th card. And so when I lay these out in 16 cards, I'm just paying attention to what the 11th card is. Okay, so this particular time, that's the 11th. Oh, that's the 11th card. Okay, so when you say A, if I want to leave A, I leave A. If I want to take A, I take A. What you say sounds like you're making a choice, but it's irrelevant to what I'm doing. I do what I want to do, regardless, because I know which card it is. And I'm gonna leave the cards there the way I, so if you say A and I want to remove A, I remove A. If you say A here and I want to keep A, I keep A and take the B away. And so it doesn't matter what you say. The Supreme Court does the same thing. And you can sit down now, thank you. And the Supreme Court does the same thing in the Obamacare case, is a really good example. Justice Roberts ruled that taxation, that there is no constitutional limitation of the power of Congress to tax and spend under the General Welfare Clause. But then there's the Tax Injunction Act that prohibited them from suing at that point in time. He said, well, it is a tax for the purpose of the General Welfare Clause, but it's not a tax for the purpose of the Tax Injunction Act. And even though Congress said it wasn't a tax, we don't listen to that. We say, yes, it is a tax. Anyway, it's A and B. He's just reaching the outcome he wants, and it's just a bunch of nonsense what they're doing. So I'll do one other really quick trick for you here. This one is kind of like the Supreme Court, but not exactly. So this is more like Congress. Here we go. All right. So do you believe in that I haven't memorized the cards?
Yeah.
What order they're in? Okay. All right. All right. The first card that's going to come out is the 7 of Hearts. You guys can see, so don't tell. All right. All right. Somebody needs to look and see what that is.
It's 7 of Hearts.
All right. 5 of Hearts. King of Spades. The Queen of Spades. These are in order. Ace of Spades.
How'd you do that? How'd you?
4 of Clubs.
I found out this morning.
Ace of Diamonds. And so on. I can keep doing all of that. That's actually, you know what, that's a good opinion of. That's federal funding of local programs. They're cheating. It's just cheating. The federal funding of local programs is they steal the money from the taxpayers, they take it to Washington, D.C., they keep a bunch for the bureaucrats, they send it back to the states, they tell the states what they have to do, and now the federal government has funded local programs. Yeah, it's a card trick. And so, other questions anybody has?
I have I don't know if it's a question. You know, some people will say, well, we just have to elect the right people, and we gotta get the people involved. All right, here we are. This is how many people we got involved. Today, I don't think that's the way that we can do it. I mean, I'd love to have the mass, like we did in '09, to go to Washington, D.C. That's not happened again. I don't see that. So we have to do something that gives it back to the states and puts it in the hands of a relatively small group, because that's what we're gonna have.
Oh, yes, you said,
100 people calling.
yeah, right,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
We have to call.
right.
We'll be
The-
doing the work.
To win electoral battles, you need about 26% of the population. Because about half the people participate, half the eligible people participate in most elections. So to win, you gotta get 26%. Do 26% of the people believe the right things? That's sketchy. And that's a lot harder, and if we're gonna send them to Washington, D.C., and it's just, again, it's one leg of the stool. Should we be doing that? Yes, we should do that as best we possibly can. It's a good thing to do, it's an important thing to do. But it's just simply slowing down the rate of the slide into the abyss. That's the best you can say about sending people to Washington, D.C. Now, I mean, I seriously looked at running for the U.S. Senate in Virginia this time. I ran for Lieutenant Governor of Virginia 20 years ago. I won the Republican nomination. I got 45% of the vote in the general election, my first try against the incumbent. I had the nomination for the asking. And I just decided, me being in the U.S. Senate, I could stop treaties, I could do a lot of good stuff. It wasn't as important as fixing the structure of the country. You've got to have good people, good policy, and good structure. The structure's been neglected, and I felt that I could do the most good for the country by advancing good structure. And you win structural arguments with someplace between 1/10 and 1%, because it's lobbying, and it's at the state level. I'm fighting them in the water, and I don't need the whole group. I just need someplace between 1/10. That's 100 people in every legislative district, or 1%. That's 1,000 people in a legislative district. In between those numbers, I got there. With 100, it's probable we win. With 1,000, I guarantee you absolutely we're going to win. There's no way on this world that they will stop us. When the teachers union tried to crush homeschooling in 1994, I organized the calling blitz on a bill called H.R. 6. We lost it on a straight party line voting committee, and 8 days later, after 3 million people called Washington, D.C., we won 422-1. So it is possible to get 1% of the population to do the right thing. I have done it previously and can do it again, with your help. I mean, when I say I do it, all I can do is I can be the match. I can't do the whole thing myself. I've done nothing. In fact, without the blessing of God, I've never accomplished anything in my life. But I'm here to tell us that it is possible to win, and so when I tell the personal stories, no, I have been the leader of these things, and that's, but I don't want it to unfairly diminish the fact that there's always a team of people that make anything like this happen.
We're trying to go the right way on your end here,
Right.
but here we got Obama that's, trying to sidestep, the Congress and everything, and destroy our federal government on the other end, and it's just like, we're being pulled apart here.
Right. Well,
We are being pulled apart.
we are, but here's the point of analysis that we need to understand. The president holds a lot of authority, more than he really was ever given. By collusion with the Supreme Court, he holds more authority than he should. The Supreme Court says that effectively they are the highest law of the land. By being the interpreters of the Constitution, they become the highest law of the land. But the states have the highest power in the land, because only the states can unilaterally change the Constitution. The people who have the power to change the highest law of the land are always more powerful than the people who have the duty to enforce the highest law of the land. I'd rather be the maker than the enforcer. And so we have the ability at the state level to change the highest law of the land back from the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court back to the Constitution as written. So we have to leave in 5 minutes, so I've got time for about 1 or 2 more questions.
Yeah, I got one I'd like to ask.
Sure.
Right now, our community is devastated by no government at all, none whatsoever. And I really think that the only way we're going to solve the problem is we have to solve our problem here and build the confidence in our community. So then we can take the power as we go, each time we go. It's just like right now, just to give you one example. We have a law director that's been convicted for different things. Right now, he is back in power, and he is still writing the laws on our ordinance and whatever. So what can we do to straighten up our community before we go further?
Well, let me answer. I'm going to answer 2 questions. What can we do to straighten up our community? And then before we go forward, I'm going to answer those separately. The same thing is true for the process I'm proposing is the same answer to how you straighten up your community. You get, you figure out what the numbers are in the local races and the local elections and in the local lobbying areas, and you organize enough people to take the rascals out. That's what you do. And it takes knocking on doors, making phone calls, calling your community, and anybody that thinks that the process that I'm leading is going to solve everything forever, they're crazy. Because all it's going to do is transfer the decision-making from Washington, D.C. back to the local community, and you still have to organize your local community and have good government there. You can have California, or you can have Texas. Your choice. Or you can have Idaho, which is really pretty good. Or you get your choice of what kind of state and what kind of community you want to have. And all that we can do by the structural thing is make sure that the decision-making is at the state and local level rather than in Washington, D.C. But let's just take the necessity of doing what I'm doing at the same time you're doing this, and they go together. People can make 2 phone calls. You get the people organized. You say, today you call the city and say, stop the guy with the corruption, okay? And those same people pick up the phone and tell their state legislators, pass a convention of the states. People can do more than one thing, especially when all I need them to do is 30 minutes in the next 6 months. I don't need them every day. I need them 30 minutes in the next 6 months. And so, and if we don't get the structure fixed, you can say whatever you want at the local level, and if Congress or the Supreme Court tells you otherwise, you're toast. I don't care what you've done The federal courts, the state courts, and everybody will collude together, and they will crush you, just like they've just crushed the whole nation on marriage. Every state voted to have traditional marriage. Every state that voted on it voted to have traditional marriage. And Washington, D.C., through a tyrannical process, crushed every state. And states can't do what they want to do anymore. And so we've got to do both. It's not an either-or proposition, it's a both-and.
Well, let me just give you, I know you got a short time. Let me just make a comment, you don't even have to comment
Okay.
on it. We have no government, because the same people's in there all the time. Nobody runs against them because they lost the confidence in them. I mean, right now they say, well, what the devil? We have nobody to consult, to talk to, and say, hey, we need to solve this problem, blah, 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 blah. And that's what our community is. And I think our community, if we're gonna get people to make telephone calls and do all this stuff, we need to get our community involved.
Well, you do. But you need to give people a reason to believe that the involvement will lead to effective solutions. And people are disheartened about it because they see the Supreme Court and others just crushing us on this front and that. And so, people could say the same thing in the homeschooling world 30 years ago. We had no voice, we had no ability, but we organized, we had smart tactics, we picked plans that could lead to success if we were successful. We didn't just, say, well, let's get yard sign. We had actual plans that would lead to success. And we out-organized and we out-hustled them. I mean, I did it here in Ohio. I argued the case in the Supreme Court of Ohio on homeschooling and helped with the legislation, helped with the rules and all that stuff. And the tactics are going to change day to day and how you do it. No state's the same. You have to have advanced tactics. But the basic involvement is always the same thing. You get good people who believe the right thing to stand up, speak up, and show up, and you win. But you gotta give them something to do that will lead to success. And I'm here to tell you, there's a lot of things that are out there that won't lead to success. This will. This will actually work. You can talk about all kinds of nonsense. Nullification is nonsense. It won't work. Beyond any other thing, there's 50,000 laws probably that need to be nullified. And try doing that one at a time in 50 states. It's impossible. And so, and beyond that, the federal courts will strike you down and be like paying whack-a-mole. You pass one, they'll have 8 pop up. And it's a thankless task, and it won't work. You've got to do what will work, and this is it. Article 5 really will work. And it's the reason that people like Sarah Palin and Alan West and Mike Huckabee and Tom Coburn and a bunch of legal scholars from the Reagan administration, like Chuck Cooper, who was the NRA lawyer, he was a top guy in the Reagan administration, and Mark Levin and me and a whole bunch of other people like that. Robbie George, who's the leading pro-life lawyer in the world, and Princeton law professor and Princeton professor, and moonlights at Harvard Law School. That our team is on board saying this will work. This is the right thing to do, and it's safe to do. And so we've got people with a lot of experience of winning. If you listen to people who've never won anything, well, God bless you. Go ahead and see how that works out for you. But we've got a record of winning, of turning unpopular tides, and so I'm telling you, this is a path to victory, and it will work if enough people help. And it will. The rising tide will help your local things as well.
Yeah.
You give them real power. Why do parents not participate in the public schools? It's because what the public school officials want them to do is to raise money for the schools. They don't want them to help on curriculum decisions or teacher decisions. In Switzerland, teachers' names are on the ballot. And if the parents don't like the teachers are doing wild stuff, they vote them out. Now, structure leads to better educational results. Because do the parents participate in Switzerland? Yeah. Why? Because they have actual power. And if you give the people actual power that matters, you get more people to participate.
Amen.
And so that's what we've got to do. Thank you all
Dr.
very
Farris,
much.
thank you so very much.